For 102 terrifying minutes, the entire world just watched as a coordinated attack unfolded on American soil. It was one of those events that leaves a permanent scar on the global consciousness. So let's dive into this. We're not just going to look at what happened on that day, but we're going to try to understand the decades of history that led up to it and the completely new world it created in its wake. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky over the East Coast was crystal clear. And for just about everyone, the day started like any other. But this date would become a dividing line in modern history, a moment that literally redefined global politics, security, and even just our daily lives. And just like that, the normalcy of that morning was completely shattered. What at first seemed like a series of confusing, horrifying accidents, well, it very quickly became clear that this was a deliberate, massive attack on the United States. This sequence of events was just unbelievably fast. At 8:46 a.m., the first plane strikes. And for a few minutes, most people thought it must have been a terrible accident. But then, just 17 minutes later, the second plane hits the South Tower. And this time, it's live on television for the entire world to see. At that moment, there was no longer any doubt. America was under attack. Then came the news from Washington, D.C. And finally, a crash in a rural field in Pennsylvania. But in the middle of all that horror, there's this incredible story of bravery. On United Flight 93, passengers started making phone calls from the air and learned what was happening on the ground. Realizing their plane was part of the same attack, they made a decision, an unbelievably courageous one, to fight back. Their actions almost certainly prevented an even greater catastrophe, likely saving either the U.S. Capitol or the White House. The immediate human cost was just staggering. In New York, at the Pentagon, and on those 4 flights, nearly 3,000 people were killed. And it's important to remember, they were citizens from over 90 different countries. This was a tragedy that was felt across the entire globe. In the middle of all the smoke and chaos, this was the one question on everyone's mind, right? How could a superpower be so vulnerable? Well, to answer that, we actually have to look back, way back, to a different conflict in a distant land that, believe it or not, set the stage for 9/11. See, this story doesn't really begin in 2001. It starts decades earlier, with the huge Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, playing out in the mountains of Afghanistan. So in 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. The U.S. sees this as a golden opportunity to bleed its Cold War rival dry, to give them their own Vietnam. So along with allies like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, they launched a massive covert operation. They poured billions of dollars in weapons into supporting the Mujahideen. These were Islamic fighters resisting the Soviet occupation. And among them was a wealthy young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. This is a classic, textbook example of what's known in foreign policy as blowback. The U.S. strategy, it worked. It absolutely helped drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. But the unintended consequence, the blowback, was that it helped create this battle-hardened, globally connected network of militants. The very forces that America had armed and trained eventually turned their attention to a new enemy, America itself. So with the Soviets defeated, Osama bin Laden's new organization Al-Qaeda, it didn't just pack up and go home. Instead, its entire mission evolved, and its sights were now set on the world's only remaining superpower. To really understand why this happened, you have to look at their stated motivations. In a series of fatwas, that's a kind of religious ruling, that he issued in the 1990s, bin Laden laid out his case against the U.S. He pointed to the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War, which he saw as a desecration of Holy Land. He cited U.S. support for Israel and the tough economic sanctions against Iraq. He framed all of these things as attacks on Islam that demanded a violent global response. Well, the American response was immediate and totally unequivocal. Within just hours of the attacks, President Bush went on camera and made it crystal clear that the United States would not only hunt down the attackers, but also any nation that gave them shelter. The lines for a new kind of war were officially drawn. In the days and weeks that followed, America's grief and shock quickly turned into action. The country mobilized for what would be declared a global war on terror, a conflict that, as we'd soon find out, would have no clear borders and no foreseeable end. The path to war was incredibly swift. The U.S. quickly identified al-Qaeda in Afghanistan as the culprit and issued a demand to the ruling Taliban hand over bin Laden. The Taliban refused, and the response was immediate. Less than a month after 9/11, American bombs began to fall on Afghanistan.
But this new war wasn't just being fought overseas. Back home, the U.S. government passed something called the Patriot Act with massive support. It dramatically expanded the government's power to conduct surveillance on its own citizens, and this kicked off a fierce, long-running debate about that fundamental balance between national security and our civil liberties.
When investigators finally had a chance to look back, they uncovered some critical failures. The official 9/11 Commission report famously called it a failure of imagination. Basically, an inability in the government to even conceive that an attack of this scale was possible. But more concretely, it highlighted a massive breakdown in communication. For instance, the CIA knew about 2 al-Qaeda operatives inside the US, but it never put them on a watch list or told the FBI. The attacks themselves, they lasted just 102 minutes, but their consequences? Their consequences have shaped our world for more than 2 decades now, in ways that are both incredibly obvious and really, really subtle. Just think about this number. The war in Afghanistan, launched in October 2001, would go on to become America's longest war. For 2 full decades, U.S. forces remained in that country, a direct and truly enduring consequence of that one September morning.
The ripple effects from that day are just a mess. The war on terror expanded from Afghanistan to Iraq, which helped destabilize the entire region. Here at home and across the West, there was a sharp, ugly rise in Islamophobia that led to discrimination and hate crimes. And a whole new global security apparatus was born, changing everything from how we fly on a plane to how we communicate online.
And really, that brings us to the final, lingering question. When you really stop and consider it all, the lives lost on that day, the soldiers and civilians killed in the wars that followed, the trillions of dollars spent, the fundamental changes to our societies, what is the full, true cost of those 102 minutes? Honestly, it's a question we are all still grappling with today.